Our first speaker will be Amit Sharma. Amit is a PhD student at Cornell University in the US, but right now he is in homeland in India. His research involves large-scale data mining and recommender systems. Today, he will speak about explaining machine learning. So Amit, welcome, and the room is yours.
Thank you. I just want to make one clarification. I've completed my PhD, so I'm now working full time at Microsoft Research in India. Uh, but thank you for the introduction. Today, I'll talk about something that I'm really passionate about: is how do we explain machine learning algorithms, and especially how do we work with machine learning in decision-making scenarios. Now, I'm sure you're familiar with different techniques for explaining machine learning models. Some are techniques like LIME or SHAP. There are other techniques based on just building intelligible models and so on. And in general, most of them have an output which looks like something on the right. You have a feature importance score. Feature 1 has more rank, feature 2 is second rank, and so on. And they are widely applicable for getting a general idea of what your model is learning. But in many cases, I find that feature importance is not enough. And what I'll do is I'll give you two simple examples to show that in decision making, we are looking for certain inputs which raw importance scores cannot give us. Let's take an example where a bank has a loan distribution algorithm which predicts whether a person gets a loan or not. Now, suppose there is a person who doesn't get the loan. A reasonable question for them to ask is, what should I do to get the loan in the future? Assuming the same algorithm will be used by the bank. Now, in this case, if I give you a feature importance score, which looks something like this, it might say that annual income is very important. It might also say that credit years is very important. But it's not really telling you that if you increase your annual income, you're going to get the loan. Who knows? Like nobody knows how this model is going to work. And so a person just has to now guess on what might be happening. On the other hand, there's a class of explanations called counterfactual explanations, first proposed by Wachter et al., which are really simple, but solve this person's problem. So they look at what if scenarios. So the user would now get an explanation of the kind: you would have got the loan if your income had been 100,000. And you can immediately see the difference in the way explanations are given. In one case, it's a summary, but it's unclear what that summary means and what a person should do with it. In the second case, it's actually a decision-making insight that a person may use if it's possible to change their income. And this happens not just when you're thinking of the end user, it also happens when you think of the data scientist or the model builder. So here, imagine like there's a hospital, and imagine that the hospital is having a cardiovascular risk prediction algorithm. So they're essentially predicting who would be at risk of a heart attack in the next 3 years. Now, a model builder might look at this model and say that here's a person who's been predicted as high risk, and what should they do to reduce their chances of cardiovascular disease? Now, this becomes interesting because, again, feature importance would not help, but even counterfactual explanations in their naive form won't help. So, for example, it is very likely, given a machine learning model, that an explanation might look like your chances, according to the model, would reduce if you decrease your age by 10. Now, this is probably true, but it doesn't help a person because you cannot reduce your age. Another option could be your chances would reduce if you visit the hospital more often. And we'll get to this more later on, but this is kind of showing up the relationship between correlation and causation. It might be the case that in the data set, people who visit the hospital often are probably much more concerned about their health, they're doing regular checkups, and therefore it turns up that they actually have a lower risk. But obviously you can see here that this is not what a person was meaning when they asked this question. And the difference here is that we want to give the user a decision-making answer, which means we want to tell them something that reduces their actual risk of disease, not what the model is going to predict. Remember, in the first case, it was sufficient to predict what the model is going to do because the loan distribution algorithm is operating in the world. Whereas in this case, there is a machine learning model that predicts risk, but that's not operating in the world. What's operating in the world is some biomedicine. And here, therefore, we want to understand the real outcomes and not the model's prediction only. And so here are the two questions that you can now frame. Uh, you might ask, what if a feature is changed? Would changing that feature lead to a change in the machine learning model's outcome? Alternatively, you can ask, would changing that feature lead to a change in the real world outcome? Uh, and these two questions require a different kind of reasoning, which I'll talk about, which is causal reasoning. And one of the interesting things to note here is that the second question may not feel like an explanation question because it's kind of asking something about the real world. But I've seen many cases, and you might have also seen this, where machine learning models are often used for decision making. And so when people look at explanations of a machine learning model, they're often using it to think about what decision would be good or what feature should be changed. And so I think it's really important when thinking of machine learning models to distinguish which problem are we wanting to solve. What I'll do today is run through these two key problems, and I'll just try to give you a flavor of how one can approach these problems from a causal perspective and how using a causal perspective enriches the definitions that we can bring to these problems. So first I'll talk about explaining the model. Here we're interested in what changes in a feature would change the model's outcome. And I'll talk about a definition of necessary and sufficiency that's central to explaining. And I'll talk about also how then counterfactuals can be used to measure these properties. And this would work for any model. And then I'll talk about the more harder case, which is explaining the world. So now you also have a machine learning model, but you're not interested that much in understanding that model's predictions, but actually looking at the features it has learned and then trying to find out which are the most important causal features for your problem. All right, so let's dive in. We'll start with our first problem, explaining the model. So for this problem, think of the bank scenario, right? Where you're really interested in what does the bank's model do. Let's assume the event is that the machine learning model predicts 1. Now, it's almost a philosophical question on what does it mean to explain an event. Actually, there's literature both in philosophy and in computer science where people have tried multiple ways of defining what does it mean to explain. And the jury is still out. It's not decided. And you can sort of understand also intuitively the complexity of it, because all you get is one event. And there could be multiple features in our model's case that could have led to that same event. So sort of going backwards and trying to get only one answer is typically very difficult. One thing that has come up in the recent literature is the idea of an ideal causal explanation. This is from Halpern et al. And this idea really sort of formalizes what typically people want when they say that, hey, I want to explain this model. The first is you want necessity. It means when I change this feature, the model's prediction will also change. So in other words, this feature is necessary for me to see this prediction. The other is sufficiency, which means that if this feature stays the same, it doesn't matter what else changes, the model will always predict the right outcome, right? These are very intuitive. I think in many cases, necessary and sufficiency together kind of give you the ideal explanation. But why is not everyone using it? I mean, this is so simple and so intuitive. Well, because they are rare. It's very hard in a typical setting to find cases where a single feature would satisfy both necessary and sufficiency conditions. I'm giving you a very simple example here. Like this is like a linear model, a binary classification, where all we are looking at is when the values go above 0.5. And now if I give you a data point 1, 1, 1, which means all features are 1, and the outcome is also 1, you can see that I can say that x1 is necessary, right? Because x1 has a coefficient of 0.4. It means that if x1 goes, there's no way you can get a positive outcome. That's good. But actually, x1 is not sufficient. And in fact, because of, as you can see, you could keep x1 the same and just change x2 or x3, and your model will start predicting 0. And you can actually just go through it. It's a simple exercise to see that no feature is sufficient here, and also that the other two features are not necessary. So what I wanted to convey was that this is ideal, but it's ideal in the sense that it's very hard to actually find such features like that. If we find such features, they are the ideal explanation. In practice, different methods do different kinds of approximations. Uh, One way you can do it is directly just quantify the degree of necessity or sufficiency. So now given a value x and fx, I say necessity could simply be the probability that fx changes whenever a particular feature is changed. And similarly, sufficiency could be the opposite. I don't change the feature, and I want to know the probability that fx is unchanged. Uh, One thing you might be thinking about is what is this probability over? I mean, this is like a strange probability. So what this probability is over is all possible values of features. So in our previous case, if x1, x2, and x3 were all binary, this would be sort of 8 configurations of their values. And what I want to ask is, under what conditions would basically the frequency of the necessary changes happening? It becomes actually quite non-trivial to estimate when features are continuous and there are lots of features. So we'll actually see 2 simple algorithms to estimate them in the next 2 slides. But before I do that, one thing I want to highlight here is that how you define these probabilities in effect kind of constrains the explanation you're going to get. So if you remember our example about age, and maybe you know that decreasing age is meaningless, you can actually define the probabilities of features such that the age is always increasing compared to the initial point. And this is one of the benefits of this framework. Like, it's really interpretable in how you can define the set of probability space for your features. All right, so super simple brute force is that you just randomly sample a bunch of points near a particular input x. If I can do that, then I will just say, I have 1,000 such random points. I'll sample each x dash one by one. And I've sampled them in such a way that xi is changed while everything else is constant. And then I can simply see whether the predictive model changed its prediction. If it does, then it gives me a sense of how much was this feature important for constraining the model to that outcome. Similarly, sufficiency, same logic. Now the only difference is I'm sampling points x dash such that xi, my feature of interest, is constant. And now I want to see the reverse. I want to see how many times does the model also stay the same when xi is same. And as you can see, these are basic sort of simple sampling approximations of the previous definition. It's very simple algorithm, but the issue is its efficiency. You can easily imagine if you want to calculate the importance of every feature xi, and you want to do it over different ranges, you would just have to sample a lot of points. And even then, you're not sure when is the right range for you to get the counterfactual. And so what people typically do in the literature is that they kind of approximate this problem. So they say that let's not randomly sample. Let's find the smallest changes to the input x that change the outcome. So here, remember, we are not interested in a single xi at a time. What we're saying is that given some x and some model's prediction fx, let me try to find the smallest change in x that would change the outcome. And you can generate a list of such smallest changes possible. And then necessity is simply proportional to how many times a particular feature is included in these x dashes that you get. So the intuition is that if a feature is really important for the model's outcome to change, then it should be changed, or it should occur in most of the counterfactuals that you can generate. If you're familiar with adversarial learning, I think this is exactly an adversarial example. We're trying to find the smallest change. And here the focus is on finding the features that are occurring in that smallest change. Sufficiency is also similar. You can say, what's the smallest change to the input x while not changing xi, right? So it's exactly the same algorithm, just one condition. Don't change xi. Now let's see how many counterfactuals can you find. And then essentially the sufficiency for this xi is inversely proportional to how many counterfactuals you can find. With this intuition, more generally, the counterfactual explanations for any point can be thought of as an optimization. In almost all settings, you're interested in some example X dash that can change the model's outcome to a different class. That's what I'm showing by the y-loss metric here. The second is you want it to be close to your initial input, and that's dist, the distance metric. And finally, this is optional, but in many cases it's useful, is the diversity of the examples itself. It's not useful if I tell you, hey, change your age to 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, all of them will give you a counterfactual, right? It's true, but it's not that useful. I think a user would want multiple features that change to get a more better understanding of a machine learning model. And that's why here diversity simply means which feature is changed, and you ideally want different features to change in different counterfactuals. There are some practical considerations that come when you consider real world applications. So we saw one example of the banking scenario where age is not something you can decrease. There's also sparsity considerations in some cases. People may not want to see minimal examples that change a lot of features, but change them in a small way, right? It's still valid, it's the closest point, but maybe it's more intuitive for people to see examples that change only a couple of features. It's much more easier to reason about them as well. There might be user constraints. User might just say that some features cannot be changed. User might say this feature is harder to change than the other. And so essentially, like, you can think of this as really like a black box optimization engine, which takes in different kinds of constraints you might have about the feature configuration, and then out comes the counterfactuals that you're interested in. To make it easy to generate such explanations, we've released an open source library called DICE, which can generate such counterfactuals for any model, either sklearn or a deep learning model. And what I'll do is just give you a small glimpse of how it would work if you had a model and you were interested in just exploring the model for different inputs. So the API goes like defining a model first, which could be an sklearn model, and then saying, I want to generate counterfactuals for this model using a particular data set D. And a method here is random, the first method that I had described to you. And what the model does then is what the DICE library does is that it then tries to solve that optimization problem and try to give you examples that look very similar, but the outcome has changed. So in this case, this is the adult data set. You can see that education probably plays a role. If you just look at this simple case of two examples, education increasing also means that the income increases according to the model. This might be okay, but then you might see something else, which is race. And you might see that race changing from white to other is also changing to an increase in income. And of course, age is also changing, right? And one of the nice things about counterfactuals is that you can interact with this and start now looking at different kinds of permutations and combinations. You might say that, hey, I just want to see if changing only race changes the outcome. And you can do that by restricting the counterfactuals you're changing, restricting the features that can be changed. You can also compute sufficiency by saying that I want to keep race constant and then change everything else. And you can generate counterfactuals for these points. As I mentioned, you can also change the permitted range. So in this example, we are saying that we believe age should only be between 20 and 30. There's no point to change age more than that. And as you can see, the counterfactuals that you see now have age restricted to those values. Now, one thing that often comes up is that there are established methods for explanation like LIME or SHAP. How does counterfactuals or DICE compare to those kinds of explanation methods? So one thing is, of course, different explanation methods are valid in different scenarios. I believe counterfactuals and DICE are most relevant in decision-making scenarios where based on the explanation, you're actually trying to make a decision. One interesting other point we have also found in our experiments is that LIME and SHAP tend to be winner take all kind of explanations. What I mean by that is if there are some features that are quote unquote really important according to these methods, those features get a high value, but rest of the features get basically close to zero. Whereas in counterfactuals, it actually looks at even if the lowly important features are sufficient to change the outcome. And so if it finds that the features are sufficient to change the outcome, they're still having an equal importance. Let me give you an example to make this point. So suppose you had a model which is written here. It's a very simple linear model again with only two features. One feature x1 has a coefficient of 0.45. The other feature x2 has a coefficient of 0.1. Now, as you can see in the table on the right, a method like Lime or SHAP would say that the first feature, rightly so, is very important. And it's probably, in the case of Lime, about 0.34 importance. Whereas the second feature has a very low coefficient, and therefore its importance is also low. It's only about 0.07. But counterfactuals look at this in a different way. When you look at this equation, right, you can think of necessity here. You might be able to clearly see that both x1 and x2 are equally necessary. If you remove x2, you will never get the outcome 1. If you remove x1, you will also not get the outcome 1. And so counterfactual methods like DICE would say that both of these look equally important. And that's what these numbers also show. The both of them are about 0.97 important. And so that's a kind of interesting insight that when you look at necessity and sufficiency, even lowly ranked features may actually be important. And this is probably what matters in the real world anyways, right? I mean, what this is telling you is that it's fine if x1 appears important. You can get your class changed if you just change x2 as well. All right, so recap, necessary and sufficiency are two kind of first principles metrics for model explanation. One of the nice things of these two metrics compared to something like SHAP or Shapley values or Lime is that this is something that can be intuitively explained to any decision maker in 2 lines, right? So what is a necessary feature and what's a sufficiency feature? It's kind of quite intuitive. There are now methods available to approximate them by loss optimization to find the smallest perturbations. And we have open sourced the library DICE that makes it possible to compute such examples for any model. But in decision making, as I was telling you earlier, this is not enough. Sometimes changing the model output gives you some insight about the model, and it might help you debug it or understand it better. But often people want to do something based on this machine learning model. They want to change the real world outcome. So in the next part of the talk, I'll talk about what can you do when you have some outcome you care about, and you're somehow using this machine learning model to effect a change in that outcome. This goes in the definition of causal effect. If you see it, if I just retrace what I said, what I want to know is if I change this feature, what will be the impact on the outcome in the real world, right? And this is the classic definition of causal effect. We can say a feature xi causes the outcome y. If changing xi leads to a change in y while keeping everything else constant. So almost imagine as if there was a real world, which is the blue world, where xi was at its value. So let's say in our healthcare scenario, xi could be the amount of exercise you do, right? What we're asking the system now to do is to say, suppose this person starts exercising more. Suppose exercise now becomes xi dash. How much would their real world outcome change? And so this red world is kind of showing a scenario where everything else remains the same about this person, just that they start exercising more. One thing to note is that everything else literally includes everything else. So not just what you have in your data set, so all observed features, but it also includes any other relevant feature that may not have been observed. And that's what makes it hard. So in a sense, you have to keep things constant that you don't even know in the data set. It's written like using the do operator. So here I'm just saying like if t was binary, then it's the expected value of t equal to 1 minus t equal to 0. Now this is a different problem, right? So our model explanation was easy because we had f of x. What's the benefit of having f of x? It means that if I just want to know how will x dash change the model's output, I can just compute it. I can literally compute f of x dash and find out how does the model change, right? Now, the hard part here is that there's no such function available to us. Like this, what happens in the real world, there's no function for that. And so what causal inference requires is a model of the world. So in this case, for example, I may assume that this y, which is the real world outcome, is caused by some features x1 to x4. And I probably also believe that these x1 to x4 features are correlated, which is what's shown in these dotted arrows here. Now, here's where things get interesting, right? A typical person would think that if I have a machine learning model that has 100% accuracy on my data set, and even you tested it on an unseen test data set, you still got 100% accuracy, right? So this model has really learned how x1, x2, and x3 can be used to predict y. One of the most counterintuitive things is that that model is still not enough for you to tell me what will happen when x is changed to x dash, right? So I've written that here in math. Suppose a model has 100% accuracy. Even then, if you just compute fx dash minus fx, it's not going to tell you in general what's the causal effect of changing x dash only. And the reason is that some features could be correlated. For example, in our health prediction model, you might have two features. One was socioeconomic status and one was obesity. In a predictive model, because all you're minimizing is the loss, it may so happen that the socioeconomic status gets a higher coefficient and obesity might get a lower coefficient. And still you would be able to predict with high accuracy. But of course, all of us know that if you're trying to predict the health outcome, probably obesity is the one that may be more connected to the biomedicine of a person, and maybe therefore obesity should have higher features, higher importance. And this is just one simple example to show that if we only look at the predictive model, we may not be able to get the true effect of changing a feature. We need something else. We need some other way of finding out whether obesity is the one that's causing the outcome or whether it's socioeconomic status. Now, this luckily is a problem that's well studied in statistics and many other fields. It's the classic old problem of distinguishing correlation from causation. And the basic idea is that you want to approximate this idea of keeping everything else constant, but you want to approximate as whatever you have. So basically all the observed features. And so what we can do is we can fit a different kind of model, which would estimate how much would the real world outcome change if only xi is changed, keeping every other feature in our data set constant. Now you can immediately perhaps see the connection between this statement and what we were doing earlier with DICE. In DICE, we were saying necessity is when only xi is changed and I want to keep everything else constant. Here, it's the same idea, but the only small difference is that the outcome is different. The outcome here is the model's, not the model's prediction. The outcome is the real world. And that's what makes it hard. Just to give you a quick overview of how you would actually go about doing this is the goal is now to convert the predictive model to a different kind of model where you are now interested in estimating the conditional expectation of y given xi conditioned on every other feature. So given that you want to understand the importance of xi, we can simply condition on all the other features, meaning all the other features are constant. And now you try to see how much does changing xi lead to a change in the outcome. And one of the interesting issues is that you don't really have values for all kinds of xi's. So you try to match or you try to find the closest points to a given point in the data set itself. I won't go in details, but depending on the data set, there are multiple methods that can be used. They're all well-studied methods from the causal inference literature. And one of the things that we have done for this community is that we have built a library called DoY that does implement many of these methods. And in case you're looking for even more advanced methods, there's another library from Microsoft called EconML. And the combination of DoY and EconML helps you transparently declare what assumptions you want in your model. and at the same time use that to compute the causal effects of each feature on the outcome. Uh, we are actually very fortunate to have now a very thriving community of open source collaborators, and we're looking to see how we can extend this library even more to have an end-to-end platform for doing causal inference. Very quickly, I'll go through an example of how do-why can be used. So suppose you're interested in does a feature X cause a change in outcome Y? A predictive model might say X has high importance, and you can also see it looks like it from the graph. And what you can do in do-why is you can say, first, I want to define my causal model. I want to define what are the confounders. Then you say, I want to estimate the effect. And in this case, when you estimate the effect, you find that observed data had a higher coefficient than what the causal effect shows you. So to recap, in decision-making scenarios, a counterfactual for the model may not be enough. And so in any real-world scenario, we need two kinds of counterfactuals, one for the model and one for the real world for decision-making. And do-why library provides a nice way of doing that. To conclude, causal definitions, I find them very useful for, first of all, defining what is it that we are looking for when we say interpretability. And they're also particularly well suited when you're using a machine learning model to make a decision afterwards. We've also open sourced two libraries that make these concepts very practical and easy to implement. Um, and I'd encourage you to try it out and give us feedback on GitHub. With that, I thank you.
Thank you very much, Amit, for the very interesting presentation and the very important topic about ML model explanation. Compared to the importance, for the time being, I see one question, but let's talk about that. Levent asks, do you see DICE being used for uncovering biases in the model?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, yeah, you can use it. We have some notebooks available online as well that show this. The basic idea is that if there is a bias in the model, let's say that the model is biased against gender, then what you can try to do is for any input, you can say, I only want to change gender and try to see if counterfactuals can be generated. So what it's essentially meaning is that if you keep everything else constant for a person, but just change their gender, and somehow they start getting approved for a loan, then probably there is a bias in the model. So this is actually connected to a definition of fairness as well called counterfactual fairness. And the idea there is exactly the same, that if you have everything else remains the same, and if only changing some sensitive features is leading to different outcomes from this model, then there is a bias that can be uncovered in the model. In practice, what happens is you might not find a machine learning model being so simply biased, in the sense that just changing the gender would not be enough in most cases. But what you can do with DICE is that you can now try multiple combinations, in which case more interesting things appear. Like you might say, I want to change gender, age, and race. And it's actually quite surprising to see how we can kind of uncover bias by just this simple trick of changing the features to change in DICE.
Thank you. Sorry, I would like now to call the attention of the audience on the poll itself. I forgot to mention this before we started to discuss the questions. So there is a poll feature on your Hopin on the left side or right side, sorry, and there you can rate the presentation. It's always a good thing to give feedback to the speaker. But I think we all see how good it was. Anyway, it was really interesting. And just as you are a researcher, can you a little bit elaborate on how you see the future improvement of this research topic, explanation of machine learning models, which is a very important thing, of course.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the way I see it is, I think this is kind of the first wave of research in model explanation, where people have looked at it from a very technical perspective. me included. So for example, what I presented was a very technical perspective of saying, here's a model. Can we actually inspect the model for small perturbations and see what output it generates? Similarly, Lime SHAP and other models have looked at it from a very technical perspective of what is the right metric to say which feature is important. I think the next phase of explainability would be more like HCI research, human computer interaction, where we would start asking questions about, sure, we have these metrics, we have 10 such metrics, but which one actually helps a doctor make the right decision? Which one actually helps a data scientist find bugs in their model or find biases, as was asked earlier? And I would involve a different kind of research. These would be more user studies. These would be more studies of systems that we have developed, and then we use them in cooperation with data scientists or other people. So I think, yeah, so my sense is that in the future of explainability, at least the most interesting questions lie at the intersection of explanations and people. And and then thinking about what tasks are useful when you think of explanations. Like one could be debugging, one could be finding bias, one could be helping an end user make a decision, and so on, right? And that's where think of this field going, is more in the area of kind of connecting from what we think is explanation to checking whether that's what people also think is useful for them in whatever task they're using machine learning for.
Exactly. Thank you. We have another question from Adam. I guess in high dimensional spaces, computational issues might surface. Have you done some tests?
Yes, yeah, that's a great question. So I think in high dimensions, if you have a classifier that has gradients, so essentially like deep learning models where gradients can be defined, then we found that high dimensions do not affect us so much, because you can essentially think of it as fitting a high dimensional machine learning model, and the same tricks and the same regularizations can be used. Just that here our loss function is to actually change the outcome of the machine learning model. Or having said that, for other models like tree-based models, or in general sort of any model that cannot be differentiated, we do see a difficulty as the number of dimensions increase. It's not just in the computational capability. So one is in the computation. Yes, I think it's much harder to now perturb, like the number of subsets becomes very large. But there's also this issue of sparsity. Like it's the explanations come up after some time, that's okay, but even the explanations might not be so useful because I'm changing 10 things together, right? How is it useful to a user? It's no less interpretable than the model itself, right? And the challenge in high dimensions becomes how to enforce sparsity so that we can still show interesting changes with a couple of features while still being representative of all these features, right? So I think that challenge we haven't solved. I think, yeah, that's a good point.